So we know there's a housing crisis in this country and that millions of families who can afford to pay a mortgage and should be able to buy a home are shut out and trapped in a rental market with skyrocketing costs because they can't get a mortgage. This is especially true for families of color who are more likely to be renters because they were denied opportunities to buy a home that white families had had those opportunities for generations. And then these same black families were targeted with the most abusive mortgages and loans in the run-up to the financial crisis. So it's a double blow. Today, the black homeownership rate in America is 43%, and it's 47% for Hispanic Americans. The African American homeownership rate is now 30 points below that of white Americans. That is the kind of gap we saw back when housing discrimination was legal. We are here today to talk about housing finance reform, and it's clear that any housing finance reform effort must focus on responsibly opening doors to homeownership to these families and easing the strain on renters, both of those things, plain and simple. So, Mr. Shelton, I'd like to start with you. Under the current system, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have affordable housing goals that help banks make more loans to low-income borrowers and low-income communities. The chairman's housing reform outline eliminates these goals altogether. If the goals are eliminated, would you expect the homeownership gap between black and Hispanic Americans and white Americans to grow or to shrink?
The gaps will grow.
The gaps will grow. I agree. The affordable housing goals have been crucial in making mortgage credit available for communities of color. And any effort at reform should make them stronger, not throw them in the trash. To replace the goals and a program known as Duty to Serve that also helps expand access to homeownership, the chairman's proposal creates a new market access fund. This is the argument that you're going to get to the same place with a new market access fund. The proposed market access fund shares funding with two other programs, the Housing Trust Fund and the Capital Magnet Fund. A generous estimate suggests that funding for the whole pot is no more than $5 billion a year. I think we all agree on that fact. So, Mr. Shelton, say the whole $5 billion went to the Market Access Fund, which is unlikely if we're going to have three dipping into it. Would low and moderate income borrowers and borrowers of color be in the same position, in a better position, or in worse shape than under the current system?
In much worse shape.
So the plan scraps the goal. It replaces the goals with a pot of money that's way too small to do the same job. Is that how you see it, Mr. Shelton?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
So I recently reintroduced my housing bill, which puts about $47 billion per year in the Housing Trust Fund and Capital Magnet Fund. In the chairman's plan, these same programs at most would get maybe 10% of that funding. So, Dr. Zandi, in an independent analysis you did of my bill, you wrote that because of those investments, the investments that would be made under my bill and other reforms that are in the bill, quote, by the end of the 10-year horizon, affordable housing supply should be approximately equal to demand. We get supply and demand back in balance. Would a $5 billion per year investment split between three programs have the same effect?
No. I would argue that your legislation should be on top of and in addition to, it's separate from the discussion around GSE reform. What we're trying to do here is make the current system work better for underserved communities, and I think that's a reasonable debate, and we had it. But I would entirely agree with you that that's not the end of the story. We need to help address another much increasingly more serious crisis, and that is an affordability crisis. We have a serious shortfall of affordable housing, rental housing, and for home ownership across the country. And each and every year, this crisis is getting worse because the amount of the home builders are having, for lots of reasons that Mr. Ugadel gave, are not being able to supply the market what they need, particularly at the low end, particularly at low price points. Mm-hmm. So your legislation, which provides significant financing and funding to the Housing Trust Fund and Cap Mag Fund to increase the supply of affordable housing. By the way, the brilliance of that is that it's so, you can ask the builders, it's very, if you go into any rural or urban community and you try to figure out, because I do this, I've tried this, go in and try to figure out how do I change the housing stock to build affordable housing. That's what I do as lead director at CDFI in Philadelphia. That's what we do. That's what we're trying to do. Every home has a story, right? Title problem, tax issues and liens, all kinds of neighborhood issues. It's very difficult. The only people who can solve that are people who are going to get the funding from the Housing Trust Fund and the CAP-MAG Fund. So in my view, that is on top of everything we're talking about. It's not it's not in lieu of everything we're talking about.
Okay, so it's going to take both to fix this problem.
It's absolutely going to take both. These are different problems.
That's right. Well, they're not
problems.
different problems. They're related to each other. They are how we get people into homes that they can afford, and how we also, at the same time, address the racial gap that is yawning in front of us. And that's the part I just wanted to underline here. The outline does not address the housing costs that families all across this country, Black, white, Latino, urban, rural, Republican, Democrat, face. And unless we set some real goals and put some real resources into doing this, we're not going to make the changes that we need to make. So thank you, and thank you, Mr. Sheldon.